A former sailor who served for almost a decade has been diagnosed with a debilitating lung condition, which his civilian doctor and now Veterans Affairs attribute to his exposure to mold and possibly diesel fumes aboard 2 Navy destroyers, CBC News has learned. The case of retired Lieutenant Alan Doucette, 36, who now lives in Moncton, NB, may have far-reaching implications for the military, which began last week to institute a series of health hazard air quality checks aboard its patrol frigates. Last year, a CBC News investigation documented how the Navy has struggled for years to deal with the blight in the ventilation systems aboard its recently refurbished warships. The new set of tests, which started aboard HMCS Winnipeg on July 15, will eventually be conducted fleet-wide. A deployable health hazard assessment team is trying to determine if engineering fixes to the heating, ventilation and air conditioning system have controlled or mitigated the mold problem. Battling the blight is an age-old concern for any warship. Senior Navy officials have insisted that whenever mold is found it's cleaned up and, more importantly, there have been no reports of health issues. But Doucette says, in his case, the suspicion that poor air quality, specifically mold exposure, was behind his condition was documented by a civilian specialist in Halifax and was presented to military doctors as far back as 2009. He was medically released from the Navy in 2012 after being deemed unable to deploy. A pair of now retired destroyers, HMCS Iroquois and HMCS Athabascan, were full of mold, Doucette said, adding he first reported his breathing difficulty and health concerns in 2007. There was extensive mold, I noticed, in the bulkheads, in the joints, Doucette, a former maritime warfare officer, told CBC News. It was pretty much dripping down the walls and on the ceiling. He said he's convinced mold, rather than diesel fumes, was the biggest factor because it was often present in the sleeping quarters and parts of the ship he frequented. There was black mold pretty much in all the living quarters, Doucette said. It's taken seriously in civilian life, but apparently they didn't take it seriously for the military. I invested the best 10 years of life up until I got sick and they kicked me out. Experts say short-term exposure to mold can cause nasal and sinus congestion, coughs, as well as sore throats. It has been linked to asthma, nosebleeds and upper respiratory tract infections. There is divided opinion in the medical community about long-term exposure, but some studies in the U.S. have suggested it can affect not only the lungs but the central nervous system, and lead to memory loss. Pat McLaughlin, a retired chief petty officer who has been raising the alarm internally for years, has said many warship crew members leaving port expect to get sick on deployment. Crew members routinely complained of what they called the AC flu and the CPF hack, he said. Doucette said his civilian doctor referred to him as the canary in a coal mine when it came to mold. His military medical records, which he shared with CBC News, say his exposure to fumes was the cause of his health trouble, but the subsequent examination by a civilian specialist at the Resurology Clinic of the Halifax Infirmary noted the presence of mold as a likely cause.